Welcome back, everyone, to Frontlines and Faultlines. It's great to have you back, and hopefully you found our programs on information warfare informative. And also, it really now sets us up for the themes that we'll be pursuing throughout the rest of the podcast that we do, which is set you in a position where you can judge the facts for yourself and use those facts to enable you to make decisions about the issues of the day. And that's really our main aim, is to take current issues and do a deep dive back historically and then build on that and tease out all of the issues that are relevant to properly forming an opinion on those subjects or issues. So we're now going to get into controversial territory, which is the situation in the Middle East, because it is one that is continuing to be current, and because also that it has been very vulnerable to a lot of this misinformation and complexity that is so hard to unpick. So I'm really pleased to be able to do that with you. And I guess going into the details of that, one of the reasons why I am very keen on this subject is that I've had a lot of background in the Middle East myself. So going to this slide, I just want to highlight why I'm so interested in this subject myself personally, which is the fact that I've spent about 40 years deeply immersed in Middle East issues, and it goes back to as being a young fellow doing my university research in Israel from 1982 to 83. Spent time living on a kibbutz there as well as part of that. And then beyond that, of course, in that university context, I was doing a lot of studies in ancient history and modern history as part of my degree and majored in those subjects. Always been fascinated by it and by all the threads that tie through to the modern day issues that we face. And then, of course, when I joined the army, I ended up being immersed through the deployment context, and that began with 6 months in Somalia, where a lot of the dynamics that were going to be playing out were confronting us there. It was the early days of Al-Qaeda experimenting with how they used Islamic relief agencies to infiltrate and insinuate themselves into the region. And so we confronted that there. But following on from that Somalia experience, I did some PhD research for my doctorate, which teased out a lot of the themes that were to surface in these contexts, to do with how security intersected with things like the laws of occupation, which we'll be doing a deep dive on. And then, of course, served for a year in Iraq, where got even more deeply immersed in a lot of the geopolitics and dynamics of the region and how that played out in getting Iraq to a steady state. Hopefully, that was the plan, at least anyway. And then, of course, as a colonel in strategy group in defence, I had responsibility for the Middle East desk, so exposed to an enormous amount of intelligence reporting and post cables from our various embassies and high commissions. And so that gives you a lot of deep background on the sort of things that don't surface in the media, etc. So a very deep appreciation also for the politics and relationships. Part of my responsibility was managing our relationships with Middle East countries where we had basing situations and learning from them what their main concerns were in the region, which is also very important to understand. And then as part of that job, helping to manage the 2006 Lebanon crisis and all the dynamics around that, and dealing with the situation being caused by Hezbollah in Lebanon, etc., and how we dealt with a large number of Australian citizens being stranded in Lebanon at the time. And then in that job too, and in the process of deployments, visiting countries like Jordan, Kuwait, UAE, Qatar, and Afghanistan. And Afghanistan particularly, while I was actually in politics and serving in the defence portfolio, my responsibility was for transition in Afghanistan. And a lot of the issues around that time do connect and intersect with a lot of the issues in the broader Middle East. And then finally, also in my political role and previously in my military role, many, many visits to Israel and the Palestinian territories, including meetings with Palestinian Authority officials in Ramallah, etc. So it's given me quite a broad perspective, but also it really hits you in the face, the complexities of the region. So that's my background. Now, in talking about the Gaza issue, it really is important to go back to a deep dive on the history, because there's a lot of, I guess, history, argument, debate, warfare that goes along around, the true connections from Arab residents and Jewish residents to this land. And my position on this, with the deep dives that I've done, is that you have really a situation where you have two peoples with a deep connection to this land. And the end result of achieving peace in the Middle East starts really from recognizing that and working forward as to how we can accommodate those connections within some sort of political construct. But originally, of course, this was an ancient land that was built around a lot of tribal movements thousands of years ago. And it seems to be, historically, as far as can be determined, that one of those tribes, coming from, I guess, the Canaanite gene pool at that time, was a group of people who consolidated around what was to become Judaism and who were to be called the Jews. And of course, that was built around a faith concept of monotheism, but also a concept moving humanity forward through a commitment to the rule of law and a development and evolution of the rule of law, which was a very novel concept in the world at that time. You started to see experiments with that in things like the Hammurabic Code. But of course, what was known to the Jews as the Torah and the Ten Commandments, and what was built on from that to eventually become about 613 different commandments, was the first experiment with regulating human relationships on a basis that eliminated sources of conflict and dealt with the means by which humans interact. So really important and critical development in that respect. And their monotheistic evolution of their faith was to lead to the other great monotheist religions of Christianity and Islam. And of course, both of those religions, in theory, draw a connection to that original religious development. But in terms of how the Jews then formed a geopolitical construct out of that connection as a community and a faith, it is quite probable that you did have their tribe members going into Egypt at one point in the context of the various droughts and natural disasters and diseases that sweep the region periodically through history, looking for food in Egypt, then becoming perhaps part of the forced labour slave construct that the Egyptians used to build their great monuments like the pyramids. And then possibly during the great drought that hit Egypt, perhaps there was an opportunity for those forced labour or slaves to leave Egypt and then form a territory that they could call home in the region that became the Kingdom of Israel. So those tribal conflicts of those early periods then evolving into this geopolitical construct that the Jews were able to create in the region through particularly the period of the kingdoms of King David and King Saul. And those kingdoms we know quite a bit about from an archaeological point of view. You really start to see the evidence mount now about the types of civilizations and structures. And it's the 4 Ps really that informed me a lot in my studies, which is papyrus, parchment, I call them plinths, and of course the types of ruins and potsherds that you will see in the archaeological digs, where you actually start to see written communications as well. You see ancient forms of Hebrew and the like, and the development of houses of worship. So there's a lot we know about these periods, and of course they really span that period from about 1020 to 922 BCE, which is before our Common Era. And you can see the variations in the borders of those states. So things were very fluid, of course, in these ancient times, and became even more fluid when you saw the rise of the empires, Assyrians and Babylonians and Persians and Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, traversing this landscape from time to time. So one of the things to note, though, if you look at this map, is the territory which is labelled there Philistia. Now, Philistia comes from an Egyptian word which describes or means the sea people. So the people that were living in Philistia actually originated from the Aegean. They were effectively ethnically Greek, and they were very much sea-focused. And so these are the peoples that are described in the Bible as often being in conflict with the Jewish settlers and Jewish territorial situations in that construct. and that wars were fought between them. The famous story involving the young David and Goliath, etc. But these Philistia residents were Greek. That's the main thing to point out. And of course, over time, you have a situation where the Philistia peoples disappeared completely from any kind of record or any kind of evidence of the area. And through the particular context of, say, the expansion of the Kingdom of Solomon, etc., and later territorial constructs. So where does this word Palestinian or Palestine then actually come from in the historical record, and why was it being used in later times, like in the formation of the Palestinian Mandate? And really, the word itself does not originate from Philistia at all. It comes from the writings of Herodotus, his histories. And so we're talking about a period in the 5th century when Herodotus has travelled around a bit. He's visited the shores of that area. He's drawn on stories and records, and he's created these histories. And in the context of those histories, sprinkled through a few of the books, is reference to Palestine or Palesta. And this comes from the Greek word for wrestler. And why did he use that reference? It's because the word Israel itself in Hebrew means wrestles with God. And so Herodotus, just doing the straight Greek translation from the word Israel, creates effectively the word Palestine, which is a reflection of this concept of there being a wrestler, which is something that's very in tune with Greek culture, who really were heavily interested in the wrestling sport and became a key feature of their development of the Olympics, etc. So that's where the word Palestine comes from. It was created by Herodotus in the 5th century. And what he was describing was a sub-region of a broader territory which was known at the time as Syria. And we're talking about territory controlled by the Persian Empire particularly, and then the Greek Empire later. But at this time, you've got an area that's been re-established under the great king Cyrus the Great, who took the exiles, the Jewish exiles who had been taken to Babylon and to territory controlled by Persia when they conquered the area of Israel and Judah and destroyed the first temple. And so they were being held as exiles in Babylon and Persian territory. And Cyrus the Great returned those Jewish exiles to their homeland and had a province there called Yehuda Medianata. So that was a specific self-governing province that Cyrus the Great created. And that province then was a self-governing province, home to the Jews, that had its own currency, etc. And this is what Herodotus was referring to, talking about a people, described their circumcision customs, etc. And so Palestine actually means Israel. Now, why did that get currency following that, particularly moving into the Latin space, so with the Roman Empire? And it was because the Romans were very interested in Greek culture, Greek learnings, Greek studies, etc. And quite often wealthy aristocratic Roman families would have Greek tutors for their children. They would be taught Greek, etc. And so the Romans would pick up terms like Palestine and use those. So later on, they would come to call what was Judea, the Syria Palestina. So that is where they pick it up. They pick it up from the Greeks. And then later on, of course, you get a situation where educated British upper-class people, many upper-class people in the Western world in the 19th century and centuries before that, also studied the classics and learnt Greek, classic Greek and Latin. And so they picked up this term Palestine from their classic studies. So that's where the name comes from. And so, really we're talking about a period where from about the 5th, 6th centuries onwards, this is a term that quite often gets used in relation or associated with that land. Then we run into the periods where you get much more historical record about the Jewish settlement and administration of this territory through the period of the Hasmoneans from 140 to 30 BCE. And that was the amongst the Jews, of course, is well known as the period in which the Maccabees fought back against the Greek domination of the area under the Seleucids and formed again an independent kingdom. And the Hasmonean kings ruled during that period, that independent kingdom. And then that rolls into the period of the Roman conquest and expansion, so that you have the King Herod and his period of and his family's period of rulership over the area from that period of 37 to 4 BCE. So you can see there's been a long period of connection from the Jewish peoples to this land, and that's reflected in the archaeology as well. Even if you go to Jerusalem today, you will see the ruins of the second temple that was rebuilt when Cyrus allowed the Jews to return, but then subsequently destroyed by the Romans. So you will see the ruins of that first temple that sit underneath the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa mosques in Jerusalem. So all Jewish groups that were dispersed following the Roman conquest of the rebellion that occurred in the kingdom, the Herodian kingdom, when the Second Temple was destroyed and there was a lot of devastation in the land, there was a lot of dispersal of Jewish people from Israel or the province of Judah at that time, or what became to be known Syria, Palestine. And they ended up throughout the Roman world or drifting around various locations where they were able to establish communities. So those Jews who ended up all the way across North Africa and eventually moving into Spain became known as the Sephardi Jews. And those Jews that remained in the sort of the Middle East world, and particularly later under the domination of the Arab conquests, known as the Mizrahi Jews. And then those Jews that were moved by the Romans into Europe as slaves through Greece, etc., and the growth of the Jewish communities in Europe, they later became designated as the Ashkenazi Jews. But all of these groupings to this day show strong genetic linkages to that original, what they call the Canaanite gene. So the connection to the land, both genetically and spiritually and historically, celebrated through their culture, commemorated through their culture, their disasters and losses, the destruction of the Second Temple and the First Temple commemorated, all of that maintaining that connection through the centuries to the land. And of course, there are a lot of other communities in the region, the Levant, that do show signs of that Canaanite gene. So we understand then the basic historical situation where Judea becomes something that's not an Israeli state, but through that time there is still a lot of and in fact dominant presence of Jews in that area in Syria, Palestine, and even through to a subsequent revolt against the Romans in 137 BCE, known as the Bar Kokhba revolts. And even after that, when there was further destruction and loss of life, you will see the continuing presence of Jews throughout history in that area, right through to all the later centuries under Arab rulership and the caliphates, etc. Throughout history, there have always been a continuous presence of Jews living in the area. And in particular, in what they call the Old Yeshuv, or the Old Jewish Community, you would see a strong presence in towns and cities like Jerusalem, and various times when the Jewish population of Jerusalem was the majority population, even into the 19th century. But the interesting thing to note about all this is that things fluctuated throughout the centuries, but that connection always remained. And in towns like Safed, where a lot of the cultural roots of the writings of the more recent times, and going back to that period, connecting all the way through human history, through the development of the Talmud, etc., from religious communities based in Safed and Tiberias, etc., but communities also in Hebron and Yaffo and Haifa, Pekein, Akka, and Nablus, Shepharam, and Gaza. There's almost never been a period until recently when there were no Jews living in Gaza, for example. So then, of course, the really big new dynamic of overcoming a lot of the imperial constructs that had gone before it was the Arab conquest, starting with the creation of Islam by the Prophet Muhammad. And he, of course, was able to unify the Arab peoples in the Arabian Peninsula through this new monotheistic religion of Islam. And it became a rallying cry, a unifying factor in uniting the Arab world and being able to then engage in its military conquests. And those military conquests were extensive. So as you can see here, those conquests extended right across North Africa and into Spain, into the area that they came to call Andalusia, and then right across the old Persian Empire territory. So a very extensive empire in which they then established caliphates. The Umayyad and the Abbasid caliphates that then were created in the next phases of history. The Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews obviously were the main residents during that period of that Arab Empire, managed to survive during that time within a certain construct. So one aspect of the caliphates is that they created a social and a legal regime where it was based on a status that was assigned to those who were non-Muslim called dhimmi. And if you had dhimmi status, you were effectively slotted into a second class of citizenship where special taxes applied to you, and there were very strict restrictions around things that you could do and your religious practices, etc. But the long-term story of that is the survival of some of these religious and ethnic groups that managed to carry through to more recent times. Periodically, of course, even suffering from violence and what you might call in relation to Jewish communities, pogroms, etc. But by and large, being able to survive and find a niche within those societies to survive within that category of dhimmi status. So then, of course, you had the periods of a lot of flux going on with Mongolian invasions and various different groupings that swept this region from time to time. But moving beyond that period of flux in a highly contested part of the world, straight into the Ottoman period, which obviously was very relevant for a number of centuries to the territory that we're discussing. And you can see that the Ottoman Empire acquired the areas of Jewish communities and Gaza in that period of about 1512 to 20 through Selim I and his conquests. But you can see the various phases and stages of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire through the centuries, effectively. So you had a number of centuries where Ottoman rule was prominent, and these were based on the Turkic peoples and their expansion, which included very deeply into Europe, almost to then the gates of Vienna, where the expansion was finally stopped. And of course, through the period of Arab rule and Ottoman rule, and sometimes various others like the Khanates, etc., there were effectively caliphate structures applied to those rules where, again, Islam was the predominant measure of the status of residence, but also it related to how these empires were effectively referenced in terms of official state religions, etc. So this Ottoman period is the most important one to the modern experience, because when we look at how the Ottomans administered their empire, they broke the regions up much like the Romans into provinces. And but you will see from this map of the provinces that existed right up until the First World War that there is no province there that's described as Palestine, no province that's described as Judea. Effectively, what you have is the Mutasafert of Jerusalem, and then you have the basic vilayets in Damascus and Lebanon, etc., and a fairly non-administered territory across the Sinai Peninsula. So this was the construct that immediately preceded the First World War. But during the Ottoman period, there was a lot of migration of the diaspora Jewish peoples back to their homeland. And these were often driven by waves of persecution elsewhere in Europe, particularly and Eastern Europe in the periods of the 1880s through to the early years of the 20th century, of the pogroms that were occurring in Eastern Europe, in Russia, etc. So then you see these waves picking up where they were able to come back, purchase land, establish settlements, and expand the Jewish community in the area, all according to Ottoman law and administration at the time. These were not invasions, they were not conquests, they were not uprisings or wars, they were basically settlement, immigration, and lawful purchases of land during all that time. But a very significant build-up of the Jewish community during that time. So that then leads into the First World War, and effectively what we see in the First World War is the British conquest of those vilayets and the mutasafrits that are referred to by the British and Australians, who were very prominent in that campaign, particularly through the period 1917 onwards, where the famous Charge of Beersheba enabled the British to break through and conquer in fairly short order the rest of the Ottoman forces and the territory that became what the British referred to initially as Palestine, and then became the Palestine Mandate. And as coming back to effectively the basis from which the British did that was the fact that right through those classical periods, Renaissance, etc., and the periods of classical study, it was always referred to as that, but not necessarily in any other way than reflecting the terminology that had been used in ancient times. And the population during that period, of course, had oscillated dramatically. Various surges or diminutions of population. And you can see the numbers here that effectively we know from certain periods or can estimate, or from census that were conducted, what the populations roughly were. But the truth of it is, by the time the British conquer that area, it's really a ragged end of the Ottoman Empire. There's no great significance to that territory from an economic point of view. So the population had very significantly dwindled up to that time. And so the British effectively are creating a temporary administration in what becomes a very backward area with the absence of that Ottoman provincial structure. At the time of the First World War, the British and the Allied powers had determined that they would step forward to decolonise. That was the theory. All of the areas of the world that were subject to imperial rule, because of the doctrine, I guess, that was proclaimed by President Wilson of the United States, which referred to the 14 principles, and self-determination was going to be a key part of American diplomacy and pursuing those goals in the post-World War I world. And so that, of course, didn't play out in many ways. A lot of old imperial structures remained steadfastly in place. But in relation to the Middle East, there were meant to be mandates that were focused on bringing those populations through to independence and self-determination and statehood. So for our purposes, the key one obviously was the so-called Palestine Mandate. Now, a lot of people talk about the Balfour Declaration as being the legal basis for doing this. That is not the case. It was a letter that was written to the Jewish community in Britain by the British government to say that the British government favoured the establishment of a Jewish state. But of course, that meant nothing unless you had a consensus around the international community about stepping forward and doing that. And then after the First World War, you had the creation of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations debated and considered this issue and produced a League of Nations mandate handed to the British government specifically to deliver the establishment of a Jewish national home in the part of the Palestinian or the Palestine Mandate that stretched from the Jordan and the border down from the Dead Sea to the Red Sea, Gulf of Aqaba area across to the Mediterranean. And then the area to the west of the Jordan River was to become a new state of Transjordan, as it was labelled at the time. So that was the specific legal basis for the establishment of self-determining states at that time. Then, of course, we roll forward. You have during this period between the wars when the British have this administrative responsibility and have this legal mandate and requirement to establish the Jewish homeland, and nothing actually happens during that time. There's a lot of fraught dynamics that then develop and unrest in the area, and the two contesting interests in the land from the Arab population, the Jewish populations burst into violence at times. And then, of course, you have the arrival on the scene of the Nazis in Germany. And we might come back to talk about that in our next program, because the dynamics around that become critical in what happens next in the evolution of the situation in Gaza and the broader Middle East. And to understand what all of that really involves a deep dive on talking about what happened in World War II. So look forward to talking to you next time about that. And of course, if you have any views, we'll be very interested to hear those in the comments. So thank you very much, and we'll come back to see you next week to talk further about this very interesting but complex issue. Thank you.